Okay, so I said I would tell a couple stories, and if you look on the screen, hopefully it is working. That is a beautiful picture of Lyndon Johnson giving Pope Pius XII an 8-inch statue of himself. Mind you, it's made out of plastic. And yes, the Pope did give LBJ a nearly priceless 15th century work of Renaissance art. Harder to say than I thought. Probably from Titian, but I'm not exactly sure. That one's kind of up in the air. You would not believe the treasure trove of stuff that the Pope has in the Vatican Museum. If you ever get a chance to go to Rome, aka if the world ever gets back to something, and never get back to what we used to consider normal, but something like it, go to the Vatican Museum. Sure, that one's kind of up in the air. Oh, I hear my voice talking in the background. Okay, so I said I would do a couple stories. There's a few of you watching. I figure, why not? And I will put this up. This will probably be the last time I'll do it. And just a couple stories. And I do want to get one thing about history done. Because I always, I just did not get as far. Everything was all messed up. Everything takes longer. This way, as you know from watching the class, because I have no idea if people are watching. And yes, my screen is bigger now. I'm wearing, of course, the Des Moines Demon AAA baseball team. They're gone now. And got to tell a couple stories about Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson was one of the most amazing characters in American history, without a doubt. And then also I'm going to tell a couple sorry, I'm just trying to find, is this it? Where did it go? There we go. Okay. So I just want to tell a couple Lyndon Johnson stories, and I can't tell all the Lyndon Johnson stories. There has never been a president like him in history, and that is both good and bad. So many of the things that I would argue are good about this country came about because of the work by Lyndon Johnson, and so many things that are bad about this country came about because of Lyndon Johnson. He really fits in with a lot of the kind of the pantheon of great American presidents, aka great as having a lasting impact. You could make the same argument about presidents like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant and Woodrow Wilson. Wow, some really good, some really bad. So Johnson was this towering figure. And to really understand something about Lyndon Johnson, you have to understand that this man had a combination of an ego that was larger than life. I mean, think about his name, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, of course, he's copying FDR. So Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, FDR. But his wife, nobody ever called her by her real name, Catherine. She was Lady Bird Johnson. Their daughters, Lucy Baines Johnson, Linda Bird Johnson, LBJ, LBJ, LBJ. I mentioned it in class. Some of you might remember he had 2 beagles. Do you remember the names? Little Beagle Johnson 1 and Little Beagle Johnson 2. His ranch. And he got it through pretty duplicitous means. I mean, Johnson, like a lot of politicians, they came out of the Senate and the presidency very wealthy. People give presidents and high-ranking members of the Senate great deals. They come out much richer, and you can see almost every president's going to come out richer, even ones that weren't very successful. But he had a huge ranch in East Texas, the LBJ Ranch. He had a TV station and a radio station in New York City. It went both ways. WLBJ, and for west of the Mississippi, KLBJ. And so do you get the point? The man had an immense ego. But part of the reason you see people with huge egos is they severely lack self-esteem. So they're desperate to get people to mollify them and assuage your ego. Aren't you great? We love you. And he was constantly looking for that. And this is a massive character flaw. You'll find this a lot in presidents. A lot of people who get high office, they're desperate for the adoration. And they care almost to the point of distraction about what their legacy will be and what people will think about them. And you can imagine how LBJ came into the presidency wanting to out FDR, and would leave an absolutely broken man. But Lyndon Johnson, who grew up in, and I'm not making this up, Johnson City, Texas. It was named after his grandfather. And I was about ready to say he was a big fish in a small pond, but the Johnsons were pretty poor. So the pond was a puddle. They had no money at all, but still the town was named after him. But he worked hard, had this gift, incredibly intelligent, clever, not thoughtful as we would normally think as thoughtful, but he was very smart. And we normally think of being thoughtful as being like an intellectual and to really think things through. I'm kind of a thoughtful intellectual type, but that doesn't mean I know anything or I'm right. That's just my manner. He was more just go, we're going to do it, and just a worker and a fighter, a tireless worker. But he got to Southwest Texas Teachers College and graduated, taught for a year, but then would run for the Senate or run for the House. And the big thing about running for the House in Texas was, at that time, there's no Republican Party. You win the Democratic primary and you win the election. And now there's parts of Texas, well, the way they've gerrymandered it, it's pretty much you win the primary, you win. Mostly Republicans, because they gerrymander it that way, but also for Democrats. And Johnson would win, just barely win in the House, and go to the House. And the thing about the House of Representatives, it's even more so now, but even then, backbenchers, people who are just elected, have virtually no power. They do nothing. All the decisions are done by the leadership. The Speaker of the House really is like a monarch, a king. And they can do so much. They decide what's going to be voted upon. They decide everything. And that's why it's pretty disingenuous when you hear speakers of the House all the way up to this moment say, well, there's nothing I could do. Garbage. The speakers could do anything within reason in that body. But Johnson then basically was bored out of his skull, made his name by just being an absolute character. He loved he loved Lincoln Continentals. Big, huge Lincoln Continentals. And he would get them because as a member of Congress, people would give you stuff. And he would drive through the streets of Washington, D.C. at 100 miles per hour. And this is in the late 30s and during World War II. Just be screaming around, oh, it's Lyndon. Now you might think, wait a second, when the police of Washington, D.C. arrest them, congressmen, people in Congress can get away with anything. They basically can't commit crimes. It's very hard to arrest a member of Congress. Now, there's a very good reason for it. It would be members of Congress in Washington, D.C. could be easily intimidated if the executive, remember, Washington, D.C. is a territory. So the ultimate power goes to the president, especially back then. Not as much now, but back then. Because D.C., it probably should be, but it's not a state. It probably should be. It should be. So they can't be arrested. And the idea is that the executive could arrest members of Congress to get them to vote a certain way. So they can basically do anything. And so he might get pulled over, but nothing would happen. He just would drive like a maniac through Washington, D.C. If you go to the Capitol, it would just shock you. There's all these metal detectors, and especially now, they're really security conscious. And I don't even talk about the protests, just all the time now. And so everyone who goes into the U.S. Capitol has to go through a metal detector, except members of Congress. They just walk right by. It's kind of surreal. The first time I was there, I went in line through, they had metal detectors, and I know what you're thinking. It was a long time ago. It actually was. It was 25 years ago. But Trent Lott, who was then the Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader with a massive head from Mississippi. Republicans were in charge. Republican Party is a Southern party now. And Trent Lott I remember it was a long line, and he just, his staff members had to get in line, and he just walked right by and didn't even look at anybody. Just a total big shot. But it was like, hey, that's Trent Lott. Okay, so, sorry, I had to cough. Still a little pollen in the air. And Lyndon Johnson would pull up. He would just do crazy, outrageous things. And most of them, I can't tell you. I just can't tell you. This is, we're broadcasting this. But he would do things like zip into the Congress's office's parking lot and get out. And Johnson was just fun. He was just this gregarious guy. People loved him. And his pictures don't do him justice, especially later on. If you look at this picture I have up here, he's got the really big ears, the big nose. As you get older, it happens to me. Everything just gets. But it doesn't show how that he was actually kind of this striking man. People call him really handsome, just magnetic. And it's weird. He's a jerk, but not a jerk. He was loyal, but not loyal. Just an interesting guy, like a lot of people. But he would get out, and there'd be reporters and people like, oh, it's Lyndon, and come talk to him. And he just would stop and literally just like right in the middle of the parking lot, people all over, just stop and go to the bathroom right there, urinate right there in front of everybody. And there was like, you got to be kidding. And Johnson would do that because he could. He was in charge. So he was, the term they would use, earthy. Another thing Johnson would do, then Johnson would run for the Senate. Because the Senate, every member of the Senate has real power. This is a much more exclusive club. And that was the design. The House would be this turbulent mass of the elected riffraff, and the Senate would be the elite that would check the power of the people. Remember, this whole system of government we have here was designed to control the masses and to have as limited true democracy as possible, the people with power. But back to this. Johnson, so he ran after World War II, and he looked like he was going to lose, but all of a sudden a ballot box came in from Johnson City, and it was all ballots for Lyndon Johnson stuffed into this ballot box. He just miraculously appeared, and he won by less than 10 votes. And he would get the nickname Landslide Lyndon. And yeah, there's some trickery done, but that's the way life is. So Johnson would become the member of the Senate, and there is where he would become the master. Just the absolute master of the Senate. He had this great ability to raise money, and the Senate is greased by money from wealthy people, and he controlled the purse strings. And so people would come to him, members of the Senate, and ask for things, money to help them with their campaign, and he would be like, sure, let's talk about your next vote. And he mastered the very arcane rules of the Senate, which make no sense. If you know anything about parliamentary procedure, it's incredibly baffling. And every parliament, Senate, House, you name it, all have weird rules. And the U.S. Senate, incredibly weird rules. Most senators don't know it. They're just too much. They just know the basics. Johnson learned every little thing. And combine that with the money, he became the youngest. Okay, there were 2 years that the Democrats were in the majority. So he became the youngest Senate minority leader, and then he would be the strongest Senate majority leader in history. He made the Senate majority leader into what it is today. Like the Speaker, massive power. So today, Mitch McConnell, Republican, very conservative Republican from Kentucky, he's the Senate majority leader, and he decides everything that happens. Nothing gets to the floor of the Senate for a vote unless he decides. And what does he do now? McConnell is in session right now, and they are confirming as many conservative judges as possible. That's all they do. That's all they do. Trump's already set a record for the number of judges. But back to this. So Johnson became the majority leader. And so Johnson started wielding power. And in 1957, he got the first, it was weak, but the first civil rights bill. And how he did it was called the Johnson treatment. And they became infamous for this, the Johnson treatment. He was this really big guy, about 6'3", but his weight fluctuated, and I'm not making this up, anywhere from 200 to 300 pounds, just depending on his stress level. Within a month, he could gain or lose 50 pounds in a month. And yes, there's a reason he had heart attacks and would die of a heart attack in 1974. That's not healthy. But Johnson would do things like this. He would get right in their face. So I showed this picture in my class. He would get right there. And he would beg, cajole, plead. He had these big meat hook-like fingers that he would sometimes jab them in the chest. He would sometimes pick guys up and get them right into their face, which should tell you something about his intimidation factor. Or he would plead with them. He would touch them, hold them, get them in. But this was rarely shown. There's a few pictures, but this was done like in the cloakrooms of the Senate. You know, these kind of things weren't shown. But there's one example. So this is Senator James of Mississippi, a segregationist Southerner, about the 1957 bill. And a photographer got 4 pictures of the classic Johnson treatment. So here's Johnson looking at James. Now, James leaning up against, James is leaning up against a desk. And here's Johnson. He's laying it out. This is what we got to do, laying it out. And he would say, this is why you got to vote. This is why you got to vote. And then here's the next picture. Here's Johnson when he would start doing the threat. And he would jab them with them, jab them. He would leave bruises sometimes, just jab people. And you notice he's like this. This is the threat. And then he would go into the pleading, where he'd come in there and say, come on now, don't you want to be known for building and making this country better? And look at James leaning back. And then, if none of that worked, it would go to the stare down, the wait, where he would get right in their face, and he could sit there and just stare at you for literally half an hour. And if you try to move, he just boom, put you right back there. Nope, you're going right back there. And I love that facial expression. And he's like, no, James is back like that. And the segregation is like, James, good, I'm glad he's doing that. James eventually, he didn't vote for the bill, but voted to end the filibuster. And so that's the Johnson treatment. And so he was the second most powerful person in the United States after Dwight Eisenhower in 1960. But for reasons no one can explain, Johnson accepted the vice presidency. And he wavered. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to run for president, and Kennedy got the nomination. And then with that, because that happened, Johnson gave up this immense power. He really thought, since the vice president is technically the president of the Senate, even though they do nothing but break ties, he thought he could do the same thing. And when he became vice president, not only did all the senators, like, finally, the man who dominated us are gone, so they ignored them. They just ignored him. He didn't have any power at all. In the White House, Kennedy's people looked at him like this country bumpkin. They were all Ivy League graduates. It was filled with men from Harvard and Yale who thought they were so much smarter and so much superior than Johnson, and they were not smarter. Yet Johnson, while he wanted to make sure he could control them, he also felt very intimidated. And Johnson was miserable as vice president, absolutely miserable. That's where he would get over to 300 pounds and hated every moment of it, especially when he started hearing rumors in 1963 that the Kennedys were thinking about taking him off the ticket. Now, I don't think they would have. That would have been a terrible mistake. They needed Texas. But it was becoming a real issue. That Kennedy did put him in charge of the space program, and that's why the Johnson Space Center is in Houston, Texas. But in 1963, though, Kennedy sent Lyndon Johnson to South Vietnam. Middle of the Civil War, Zim is still president, and in South Vietnam, Johnson, he's like, another fact-finding mission. But as soon as he got out of Washington, D.C. and was flying in an Air Force transport plane, this is before they had anything like Air Force Two, he was flying over, he just became kind of energized. He's like away from the Kennedys now. He's back in charge. And when he landed at Ton Son Hut Air Force Base, which is about 20 miles from Saigon, he got out and there was an honor guard met by President Zim, people all over. It's just like, yes, I'm back. This is what his vision was. He thought the vice president would be, kind of like a mini president. And he became energized. And they drove this big motorcade into town, and it was lined with thousands of South Vietnamese civilians, all waving American flags and South Vietnamese flags, cheering for LBJ. Now, this is a pretty dangerous 20-mile road. They technically cleared it, but there's Viet Cong everywhere. But Johnson, in his limousine, just saw it and was just getting more and more excited, and he demanded they open up the sky roof, and he jumped up and started waving through to the crowd, and the Secret Service. Or no, everyone's like really worried, but he's waving at him, cheerful, everything like that. And finally he beats the roof of the car and says, stop, let me out. and he jumps out of the car, and they're chasing after him, and runs into the crowd and starts shaking hands with people. Hello, I'm Lyndon Johnson, the Vice President of the United States. And now, this, by the very nature of the way things are, Johnson was a good foot taller than was everybody he's shaking hands with. And he's shaking hands and picking people up and just happy as heck, and yells to his staff member, "Get my pencils." Now, politicians, especially back then, it was a big deal to hand out buttons or pens or pencils with your names on it. And Johnson loved doing that. You can imagine, he loved things with Lyndon Baines Johnson on it. And so his staff member came back with this big bundle of pencils. But the funny part was, they didn't have any pencils that said Lyndon Johnson, Vice President. They still said Lyndon Johnson, Senate Majority Leader, Texas. And so he started handing those out to Vietnamese civilians who had no idea what it was. They were ordered to be there. They didn't know who Johnson even was. Just, you have to go cheer. They were not big supporters of Johnson. And so he's handing this out, and he comes up to this little old man. And this man, small, kind of cowering, hunched over. And Johnson runs up to him and said, this is Farmer. This is a person of South Vietnam. This is the person we're fighting for. And he picks him up and says, the people of the United States have got to know why we're here, why we're helping South Vietnam. And he picks this man up and carries him to his limousine. And the guy's just, no one knows what to do. And he throws him in the limousine and says, take me to a hotel. And they drive to the hotel, and Johnson goes back and forth from waving through the window and talking at this cowering man who can't speak English and has no idea what's going on. They pull up to the hotel, and Johnson says, take this man to the United States. And so his driver and the couple military guards are like, okay. And they drive back to the airport and put him back on the very same transport that Johnson just got off, and it was flying back first to Honolulu, then to San Francisco. And they throw this man off and they take off. No one has any idea who this guy was. They just took him up, and he is cowering in the back of the plane, terrified, just assuming it's over. I'm flying over. He's never even been on a plane before. Nobody on the plane could speak Vietnamese. He could not speak English. They land in Honolulu, and at first thought, well, is this a stowaway? He goes, no, Vice President Johnson wanted him back in San Francisco. Okay. And so they fly him to San Francisco. And they finally take this poor man off. Johnson has by then totally forgotten. Everyone's forgotten. He stays there for a couple days. They find someone who can speak Vietnamese. They figure it out, and they fly him back. That's how Johnson. that was Johnson. There's a couple other stories about that, but that's Johnson in South Vietnam. But when Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson, who was miserable in the car behind Kennedy, he really was miserable. All of a sudden, the story was, it's like somebody flipped a switch on. This miserable, sad man, all of a sudden, I'm in charge. I'm back. And Johnson took over. Just took over the way Johnson did when he was Senate Majority Leader, giving orders. They assumed that the assassination might be part of an operation to knock out U.S. leaders as part of a surprise attack by the Soviet Union. So they got him in the air, got him back to Washington, D.C., and he really took over. And that is where Johnson really came into his own. Just absolutely came into his own. He started getting the bills that Kennedy couldn't get through, and Kennedy was kind of not trying to get through. Johnson pushed through the Civil Rights Act. And let me give you one famous story that happened during that. So while this is going on, in '64, George Wallace was not allowing African-American students into the University of Alabama. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, he would run for president in '68 in the American Independent ticket, Dixiecrats. He'd also run in '72. There'd be an assassination attempt, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he tried to run again in '76. You listen to Wallace today, and he sounds like a lot of listen to Wallace now, what he sounded like back in the '60s. He sounds like a lot of politicians today in their reaction to the protests. It's rather unnerving to me. But George Wallace came to the White House because he would not allow African-American students into the University of Alabama. The court order said that. The federal government said that there was a standoff between U.S. Marshals and the Undersecretary, the Assistant Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbaum was there, and later become Attorney General. And they were trying to demand Wallace. And Wallace, that's where he made his very famous statement, segregation now, segregation forever. I will never allow a black student into the University of Alabama. And he actually said something else, but we're not going to go there. And so with that, Johnson called in Wallace. And Wallace made a big deal. I'm not going to allow Johnson to push me around. I'm going to come out of there. I'm going to say, Johnson tried to get me to open up this school. No way. So Johnson brought in Wallace. And Wallace was probably 8 or 9 inches shorter than Johnson. And Johnson knew that, so he was going to use that. But Wallace came in strutting into the White House. But the White House is kind of awe-inspiring. I mean, you're into the White House. So this is a big deal. Johnson, they had him brought into the Oval Office. Now, inside the Oval Office, Johnson had a couch. The couch, they took the legs off of the couch. So the couch was really, really low. So Wallace, who wasn't already, he's not very tall anyway, sat on the couch and thought he's really sitting low, like in the little child section. John Kennedy had a big rocking chair. He had this horrible bad back he got during the war, and the only thing he'd be comfortable in was this big rocking chair. And Johnson, would inherit the rocking chair. And Johnson loved this big rocking chair because he could sit in this tall rocking chair and kind of rock. He really just liked that. And rock, yes, that's what you do in rocking chairs. So imagine, Wallace is there sitting in this little couch. Johnson comes in, they shake hands, Wallace sits down again. Johnson gets in the rocking chair and begins to kind of nudge the rocking chair over. And he's way up. There's a big rocking chair. And he gets closer and closer to Wallace. And Wallace says, states' rights, blacks have their own schools, white have their own schools. I'm going to stand up for the people of Alabama. This is a matter of freedom. All that pro-segregation garbage. And Johnson, no, this is a court order. We have to obey this. And every time he would talk, he'd scoot the chair a little bit closer. Talk, scoot the chair a little bit closer. Talk, scoot the chair a little bit closer. Until he's literally right next to Wallace. And Wallace is trying to get away, and Johnson has a chair position, so he can't slide anywhere on the couch. And so he is there in the couch. And Johnson starts going, you must obey federal law. I'm not going to allow a governor to do this. Don't you understand? And then he said, what kind of man do you want to be remembered for? When you die and they make your tombstone, what do you want on your tombstone? Do you want George Wallace, he hated? Or do you want George Wallace, he built? He meant building a better country. What do you want? What kind of person do you want? And he kept saying that every time. Now he's up to him. He started leaning the rocking chair over, then leaning a little bit more. So you imagine my point, kind of leaning more, leaning more, leaning more, until he is like right over Wallace. And Wallace is kind of back like this, and Johnson is literally just inches away. Who do you want to be? What kind of person do you want to be remembered for? And Wallace finally just, and so the press is all over waiting for them. They come out to the back porch then after this meeting, the few Johnson aides there said the most amazing thing they've ever seen in their life. And George Wallace came out and said, I will guarantee that black students will be allowed into the University of Alabama and they will get protection from the state police. He said it right there on national TV. And then Wallace walked away and went to his aides and said, never let me alone with that man again. I will come out for integration the next time. And that was the Johnson treatment. It was a remarkable thing. I mean, that's wow. And Johnson, part of the thing though is he had this other side. He wanted to absolutely dominate. He would walk around the White House and he'd have meetings. And the thing about it was he inherited all of Kennedy's staff. So all these Ivy Leaguers who looked down upon him, but now Johnson's president. And so he's gonna, even though he was still intimidated by him, he wanted to make sure that he was in charge. And so, for example, he'd be walking, he never quit working. He worked from the moment he got up in bed, he expected to be working, to the moment he went to bed. And in the middle of the night, he woke up, he's gonna call his aides and start working again. And so Johnson would be walking through the White House, and walking around with him, they'd be surrounded by all these, all the way from aides to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and he would be walking along and then would turn and say, I had to go to the bathroom. It's human. Go in the bathroom. They all were expected to follow him and stand around him no matter what while he went to the bathroom. He expected them all to be there. When he went down, there was a pool in the basement of the White House. When he went down to the pool, he expected them to not only follow, but they all have to go swimming with him, and you know it, they all had to skinny dip. There's a few pictures of Johnson in the pool with like Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State. They're all naked. You can't see it the way they do the pictures, but Johnson made them all. Why? Because he could. He's in charge. So, for example, at the executive meeting room outside the White House, this big, huge table, Johnson would come in, and there's a seat for the president, but Johnson didn't care. He just would kind of walk around, and then he would just stand over somebody who's sitting there. And they would have to go, oh, sorry, Mr. President, I'm in your seat. And they'd have to get up and Johnson would sit. And then he'd sit down for a while, then he'd get up and kind of go to another seat and just stand there and glare at them until, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm in your seat. And since everyone's working all the time, they're eating their lunch there, and Johnson would walk right up to them and just grab like their sandwich out of their hand, take a bite, give it back, walk to the next person. That's the way he operated. One more story about Johnson. So Johnson, he had these quirky little habits, especially during the war. He could not sleep. He'd go down to the Situation Room and just, it just killed him what was going on in Vietnam. Doesn't mean he wasn't responsible, but it killed him. But every night about 3 o'clock, Johnson would get up, and he had his own separate room from his wife. And so he would get up and about 3 o'clock in the morning and have to go to the bathroom. And instead of going to the bathroom, he would walk to the back. There's a deck, the kind of a round portico at the White House. There's columns overlooking it. The president will give speeches there. They call it the Rose Garden, but that's where he would, there's a deck up there. Johnson would go up on the deck, just out there, out in broad, I'm about to say daylight, but night, but out in the open, and he would go to the bathroom over the edge of that into the ground below. And he would do that every night at 3 o'clock. Every night, like clockwork. Well, if you've ever been to the White House, it just surprised you. There are Secret Service agents everywhere, all surrounding Johnson, or surrounding the White House. It's actually kind of amazing. When I was there the first time, and I remember going out the front door, that's where we left the tour, and I wanted to take a picture of the column because there were still bullet holes from the War of 1812. And I just about got my camera out, and boom, there was an agent right there to make sure I wouldn't take a picture of the things you weren't supposed to. And just there he was. And they're everywhere, and they're in dark suits. You'd think they would stand up. No, they're just all around it. So at night, there are Secret Service agents standing all over. So every time there was a new Secret Service agent and Johnson was president, they would have that Secret Service agent, and they'd get the night job, the new guy. And they would tell the new guy, okay, you got to stand right here, right here. That's your spot for all night. So they'd be standing there, and about 3 a.m., Johnson from above would greet them. Okay, so do you want any more stories? I guess I do have. Let me tell you one more Johnson one. He, actually, one thing about Johnson. He used to drive Lincoln Continentals and loved to drive fast. Well, at the LBJ Ranch, that was relatively dry with lots of little reservoirs, and there was a working cattle ranch. He would take a vacation, and they would go to the LBJ Ranch, and he would bring everybody with him, or use the phone. They called the phone like his Excalibur, and he would be on the phone all the time talking to people. We know a lot about what Johnson said or did because he recorded all his phone conversations, and they are remarkable. But there you can really hear his true feelings on Vietnam, and it's why it's such a tragedy. But he would go to LBJ Ranch, but Johnson did not go there to rest. A vacation for Johnson was going someplace else and work. He's not going golfing. He's working. And but he would take breaks and drive around the LBJ Ranch. And he would go off the roads and trails in Lincoln Continentals. He loved Lincoln Continental convertibles and go full speed through the LBJ Ranch. And whenever there was visiting dignitaries, he would always say, "Let me take you for a drive." And they'd all jump into the convertible, and most of them had no idea what's happening. And he would take off just full speed, as fast as he could go. And people would be like, "Ah!" You know, nearly falling out. The Secret Service agents would be following in another vehicle, and he would try to lose them. And there were these reservoirs all over for the cattle, and he really liked to drive full speed into the reservoir. Destroying the car, boom, walk out, get a new car. In fact, Ford would make him an amphibious car so he could drive through the reservoirs. And the other story was he'd be driving through, he'd be drinking beer. He'd be drinking beer while driving full speed. Don't think about it for a sec. But while it's going, he'd be throwing the cans out and drinking. And then he'd have to go to the bathroom. And he just would stop, pull up, and go right there because he's Lyndon Johnson. So there's a famous story where, excuse me, this is in 67. The war is heating up. A lot of top-level reporters are there, and also members of Congress, and a couple ambassadors were there. It was a big deal having to do with the Vietnam War, and also just after the Six-Day War. So just to get the point, this is a big thing at the LBJ Ranch. In fact, that's where they had the Chancellor of Germany came over, and Johnson put on a big barbecue where they had a big fire going, and they put steaks on pitchforks and put them in the fire. And Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of West Germany, was like, "Wow, this is the greatest steak ever." For some reason, that just always makes me laugh. But Johnson did what he always did. He piled everyone up into the car and took off cross country across the LBJ Ranch. And Secret Service are chasing him, falling behind, you know, desperately trying to stay with. But there's also 2 vanfuls of reporters with cameras going after him too. All this windy, like little mini convoy going through the ranch as Johnson is just destroying these vehicles. Hey, Ford would give him a new one every time. He destroyed one. And the Secret Service agents were also worried, you know, whatever Johnson does, I think you know where we're getting to. This will be on film. So Johnson is driving through, and Johnson did what he always did. He stopped, got out, and was going to go to the bathroom. Well, a bunch of Secret Service agents come sprinting. There were 8 or 9 of them. And so the car, imagine the car on Johnson's back here, and he gets out. They form a circle around him with their back to Johnson like this to hide what Johnson is doing from the press. Which, yeah, I mean, what else, you know, but to hide through him. And Johnson, you know, irritated, but didn't say anything. He was irritated by this. So one of the agents is standing there, and he's back to him, and all of a sudden he kind of felt the back of his leg was getting wet. And he looked back, and Johnson is right there going on his leg. And you know, what do you say? It's the president. And he looked at him, kind of did one of those looks, and Johnson just stared at him and kept going. And finally he said, "Mr. President, my leg." And Johnson said, "Son, that's the president's prerogative." Lyndon Johnson was an interesting guy, but when he dropped out of the race after the Tet Offensive, and I told you, it broke him. You know, this guy was a giant. Nobody did that. I mean, he got George Wallace to say he's going to protect black students. Wow. After he dropped out of the race, but he's still president. You know, that was in April of 1968. Johnson walked into that executive meeting room. He walked in, and he had this kind of blank look. And this is just 2 days after he dropped out. And he looked at his staff member sitting there, and he just said, "Where do I sit?" And the story was men had to leave and start crying. That's when they realized this giant was broken, just broke. And that's a good place to finish the Johnson stories. It was an amazing story. Yes, he would go back to the LBJ Ranch. He grew his hair long and tried to run his ranch like the executive, but it's a tragedy in so many ways, and a lot of it of his own making. Were those good stories? I was going to tell you one other one. Oh, I got to tell you one. So, car stories are actually pretty funny. Camp David is his camp outside. Sorry, I just thought of something funny. Camp outside of Washington, D.C. The presidents go meet. That's where, like, the Camp David Accords in '78. And it was a kind of a small military base, but beginning in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower would go there a lot. He'd golf there, and Eisenhower would take breaks there. Eisenhower loved to golf. Eisenhower would golf and have heart attacks. Hey, he smoked like 50 cigarettes a day. But so Camp David was also a place where the president can get away, and I guess it's just beautiful there. And it's in the mountains, and there's a lot of windy roads that are on the mountains. And in 1974, in the height of Watergate, Leonid Brezhnev came to Camp David, and they just had the SALT agreements. The U.S. has eventually broken almost all these treaties, but which is a tradition in the United States. Remember Tecumseh, but they. So Brezhnev and Nixon were there, and they're at Camp David, and Brezhnev loved to drive convertibles fast. This should remind you of something. And so they thought it'd be great if Nixon and Brezhnev could go take a drive. And so Brezhnev could speak a couple words of English, Nixon could speak a couple words of English, but they couldn't really communicate. Well, they were going to take him for a drive just with a driver and look at things. And Brezhnev said, I want to drive. And so Brezhnev got in the driver's seat, Nixon got in the passenger seat, and before anybody else could get in, Brezhnev takes off down the road. Full speed, winding through the roads, going up on two wheels with these sheer cliffs, nearly rolling the car a number of times. No seatbelts. Hey, there were no seatbelts then. Nixon is being hammered all over the car. Brezhnev is laughing and going fast, screeches to a halt at the edge of it, before going off a cliff, laughing, backing up, doing all this stuff and getting out. And that's how Brezhnev nearly killed Nixon. Okay, so I think those are pretty good stories. And I think I'm going to call it quits right there. Are there any questions or anything else you want to hear? Unless you want to hear really quick about the election of 1980. I thought about telling you a couple of the stories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the Johnson stories take precedent. And there are a couple of brushes of me with presidents, but you might have to wait. Maybe you should take special topics and you hear I'll tell those early on in the year. Any questions? Do you want to hear anything else? I think I'm about done. Nobody wants to type anything in? I will save this if you want to watch this again. All right. Well, I don't plan on coming on tomorrow. If I get a few people asking me, maybe I will, because what the heck. That somebody does want to hear about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What the heck? I'll tell you the story right now. Let me do the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where are we at here? Where's my mouse? I'll tell you one quick story about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, this is an amazing thing. All right. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the 22nd, that's when Kennedy announced the blockade. And it was on the 24th that the first Soviet ships arrived. And on the 26th, though, 5 things happened. And one we didn't even know about. 5 things happened. I'll tell you this last one. 5 things happened. And let me tell you them real quick. First off, and they're just really pretty funny stories. Just amazing things that happened on one day. If any one of these things would have gone wrong, the world would have blown up. Okay, August's pun has now made me want to quit. I'll tell you this real quick then. So, early in the morning on the 26th, the U.S. was still doing spy flights. A U-2 was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, and this is called an SA-1 right here. They're massive surface-to-air missiles. They explode with shrapnel all over. Shot down the U-2. And this was almost certainly done, well, we knew at the time, by a Soviet crew that was there inside Cuba. They had a bunch of military advisors and people training the Cuban army. And the Air Force said, hey, they shot at us. Let us go to war. Let us bomb. Let us bomb now. And Kennedy actually, in the XCOM meetings, I mentioned this before, which were all recorded, this was like, we've got to go, we got to go. And that would have accelerated it to war. But let me tell you, and while they're going on about this, and they're trying desperately to avoid war, oh, we jumped, not the snarks, NASA. Remember NASA? They're launching rockets. And rockets, they're testing rockets. They're trying, this is just the beginning of this is Project Mercury in that picture there, but the Gemini program to get 2 men into orbit working on going to the moon. Well, they're testing rockets the whole time. And so they had planned to test on the 26th. And this was planned long before, months before, a rocket to get further up in the atmosphere. So they take off from Florida. So Cape Canaveral right here. Now I put this map up here even though it doesn't show it. Cuba is right here. Everybody is freaking out about the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're also focused on this, that NASA didn't bother to tell anybody to remind them that they're launching. And so they launched a missile. U.S. radar picked up on radar a missile entering the atmosphere. Now, those first initial radar shots, they couldn't decide, they didn't know if it was going, what direction it was going. It was a missile. And it looked exactly like a missile that had taken off from Cuba on its way to Washington, D.C. And this caused panic. And for 5 minutes, it was like this, they've launched. I mean, they only have 10 minutes for the missile hits from Cuba. And it was like, we got to launch now. Get Kennedy shelter, but it probably won't matter. This is a 1 megaton bomb. There's nothing we could do. And it wouldn't be until a half hour after launch that it was confirmed it was actually NASA. So we just had the U-2 shot down and then this. So in XCOM, everybody is freaking out. I mean, absolutely freaking out. And Kennedy, who liked to let his staffers talk and then he would come back in. So we let them talk and then come back and forth, which would actually be a pretty good move. Let them talk freely without, the boss listening. And Kennedy came in and heard this, and I mean, this is like the consensus was, things are out of control. We might have to go to war. Which, wow. And Kennedy kind of looked around and thought about it logically. It'd be crazy in this tense of a situation for the Soviets or the Cubans to shoot down a plane. So this had to be an order by just somebody on the ground, which it turned out it was. A Russian colonel just was mad and fired. No one's communicating at NASA. And Kennedy, this is all on tape, but it's really hard, it's really scratchy. But Kennedy said, kind of looked at him and kind of got all this and said, there's always some dumb son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. And everybody kind of stopped and laughed. Tension reduced. We might not go to war. But remember the panic with this missile? An alert went out to U.S. missile sites in Japan, Italy, Turkey, the United States, and bomber sites for potential attack. Well, at a SNARK base, and SNARKs were these cruise missiles. And they would fly low, about Mach 2, huge weapons, incredibly inaccurate. In fact, these things are crazy. They actually had weapons. They carried like a 5 megaton nuclear bomb, and they're in Japan. And they had long ranges. They could reach many of the sites in the Soviet Union. Well, got to the base in Japan, not as a warning, but the Soviets attacked and launched. And, oh my God, and the battery commander came, I mean, literally, it's like, we got to launch. And he went to his XO and said, his executive officer, and said, do we launch? And they talked about this, and the commander's like, I have to launch. And the executive officer said, his second in command, said, we got to get confirmation, because we would have got some kind of warning before this. And he's like, oh, okay. And they sent the confirmation back, and the commander was like, I can't wait. What if we're hit on the ground? We got to attack. And literally seconds before he would launch, starting World War III, they got the confirmation back. And the SNARKs were not launched. And then, And then well, I won't tell you this story. And then at the same time, because we're jumping the gun here, a U-2 spy plane, another one, but this one was checking weather. They were constantly checking the weather over Siberia. Constantly checking the weather over Siberia. Why over Siberia? Okay, they couldn't fly over Siberian airspace, but U.S. bombers would fly over the Arctic and vice versa. Well, Soviets didn't have any bomber, but also missiles. So the U.S. needed these high-level weather planes, aka U-2s. Well, the U-2 got lost. Its compass started malfunctioning, and it lost radio contact, and the pilot got lost and accidentally flew over Siberia, Soviet airspace, thinking it was Alaska. The Soviets scrambled these massive Sukhoi fighter planes. They're like 60,000 pounds, these massive things. But they could shoot down a U-2, scrambled them. The same time, the U.S. scrambled F-106 fighters, these Delta Wing fighters right here, very good fighter planes. They'd be used into the 1980s. They scrambled those to try to erase who could get to the U-2 first and turn it around. And the F-106s arrived there just minutes before the Soviet plane did, and by hand signals got the U-2 to turn around, and they got back over U.S. airspace. If that U-2 would have been shot down, the second one of the day, wow. And at the same time, there were a bunch of confrontations between Soviet patrol planes and U.S. planes. So you get the point here. Last one, on the same day, as you can see from this animal right here, what animal represents the Soviet Union is coming? I think you know. What's the animal of Russia? I think you know. So, at an Air Force base in Minnesota, and this Air Force base is basically gone now, but it had B52s there. So long-range bombers. And the men were on edge. They were guarded. They were absolutely convinced that communist saboteurs, sleeper cells in the United States, were going to attack these bases. And all of a sudden, all their sensors went off. It looked like an attack was happening on their bases right now. And they sent guards out, oh my God, an attack. And they sent out word to Strategic Command Headquarters, which is in Omaha, Nebraska, middle of the country. Omaha, Nebraska, we're under attack. And they scrambled, meaning they took off all the alert bombers in the United States, Europe, and Japan, and told the bombers that were orbiting around the Soviet Union to get ready to attack. All there. And because somebody was attacking the base. The Go to Liberty, it's actually the bear. And what did they find there? A black bear. A black bear was shaking the fence and then walking down and shaking the fence. Yeah, a Soviet bear was attacking the base. And that's how we blew the world up. No, that's all true. All in one day, these 5 events happened. And they turned the bombers around because the Soviet bear, as it turned out, was a Canadian bear. So, just very polite. And so with that, that's how we nearly blew the world up. And by the way, I keep on mentioning that the World War almost happened. Well, the Soviet missiles were not yet in place, and that is true. And so you think, well, if the U.S. used bombs, the Soviets didn't have nuclear missiles. That's true, but they had regular gravity, free fall nuclear bombs that could be put on Soviet planes. They had a plane called Tu-22s and Su-28s, these bombers. And they would have used them. Castro would say later, and would say that, in fact, he told Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, that he told McNamara, oh, I begged the Soviets to let me use those weapons. If the U.S. would have attacked, invaded, bombed, the Russians would have used those bombs, the war would have escalated, and we wouldn't have to worry about this pandemic. Okay, so on that happy note, if there are no more questions, I want to talk. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis stories are great. Okay, I would like everyone to have a great summer. And if you have any more questions or anything else, you can go ahead and send me. I'm going through the grades and everything right now. This very awkward and weird year is finally done, but hopefully next year will be back to normal. And so please let me know how things are going next year when you're in class, in school. Hopefully we'll be in school. And I hope a lot of you will take special topics and and I will tell you a couple more stories that I tell the classes normally, but you got to be there. We got to see each other for those stories. All right, well, have a great summer, and I will see